The moment someone tells you that another person will always come before your feelings, the relationship changes whether you admit it or not. 3 months later, she would show up asking for the one thing she assumed would always be there. But on that cold October evening in Denver, I had no idea how much my life was about to change. My name is Brandon Hayes. I was 41 years old at the time, and if you had asked me then whether my marriage was in trouble, I probably would have said no. Not because everything was perfect, but because I still believed commitment could overcome almost anything. I believed that showing up every day mattered. I believed loyalty mattered. I believed that when two people got married, they agreed to put each other first. Looking back, I should have realized sooner that Natalie and I were no longer living by the same definition of marriage. The evening started innocently enough. We were attending a birthday dinner for one of Natalie's longtime friends at an upscale restaurant overlooking downtown Denver. The city lights stretched across the windows like a sea of tiny stars. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. People laughed around us while servers carried plates of food through the crowded dining room. It was the kind of place where everyone looked successful, comfortable, and happy. Natalie looked beautiful that night. She wore a dark green dress that matched her eyes, and she seemed more relaxed than she had been in weeks. Across the table sat Tyler Morgan, her former boyfriend, a man whose name had appeared throughout our marriage more times than I could count. At first, years ago, I convinced myself their friendship was harmless. Natalie always described him as an important part of her past. She said they had remained friends because they respected each other. Whenever I expressed discomfort, she reassured me that I had nothing to worry about. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up because every conversation ended the same way. I became the insecure husband. She became the reasonable wife. Tyler became the misunderstood friend. As dinner continued, old stories started circulating around the table. College memories, road trips, shared experiences. Predictably, Tyler appeared in almost every story Natalie told. What bothered me was not the stories themselves. It was the way her entire face seemed to light up whenever she talked about that period of her life. Then one of the guests laughed and asked how Natalie and Tyler had managed to stay so close after all these years. The question seemed harmless. Several people smiled while waiting for her answer. Natalie did not hesitate. She glanced at me briefly before speaking. "You cannot stop me from seeing Tyler anytime I want. He is an integral part of my life." The words landed harder than anyone in that room realized. A few people laughed awkwardly. Someone made a joke. The conversation moved on, but I stayed frozen in my chair. I remember staring down at my glass of water while condensation slowly rolled along the side. The restaurant noise seemed farther away. What hurt was not that Tyler mattered to her. Everyone has a past. Everyone has meaningful relationships. What hurt was how casually she dismissed my place in her present. She was not protecting our marriage in that moment. She was protecting her connection to him. More importantly, she seemed completely comfortable doing it in front of everyone. I did not argue. I did not create a scene. I simply sat there and listened as the evening continued around me. Looking back, I thought that was the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part came later when I started noticing how many warning signs I had ignored over the years. The drive home was quiet. Denver's skyline disappeared behind us as we headed toward our neighborhood. Natalie scrolled through her phone while streetlights passed across the windshield. Neither of us mentioned what had happened. When we reached home, she walked inside as though nothing unusual had occurred. I remained in the driveway for a few moments, staring at the dark outline of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. The air felt colder than before. Something had shifted that night. I could not fully explain it yet, but for the first time in years, I stopped asking whether Tyler was too involved in our lives. Instead, I started asking a much more dangerous question. What happens when your wife no longer sees you as the most important person in hers? The question stayed with me long after that dinner ended. Not because I could not answer it, but because I was afraid of what the answer might reveal. Over the next few weeks, life returned to its normal routine on the surface. Natalie went to work. I went to work. We shared meals, discussed errands, and watched television in the evenings. From the outside, nothing seemed different. Yet something had shifted inside me. Once you begin paying attention to something you spent years ignoring, it becomes impossible to stop seeing it. A few days after the dinner, Natalie casually mentioned that Tyler would be joining a group brunch on Saturday. She delivered the information while standing in our kitchen pouring coffee into her favorite mug. Morning sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the countertops and casting long shadows across the floor. I simply nodded. For a brief moment, she looked at me as if waiting for a reaction. When none came, she continued talking about her plans. Looking back, I think that was the first time she noticed something had changed. In the past, I would have asked questions. I would have explained why the situation made me uncomfortable. I would have tried to start a conversation. This time I said nothing. As October faded into November, Tyler seemed to appear everywhere. Community events, weekend gatherings, holiday planning discussions, group dinners with mutual friends. His presence had become so normal that nobody questioned it anymore. Nobody except me. The more attention I paid, the more patterns I noticed. Natalie always answered his messages quickly. She remembered details about his schedule. She often brought up stories involving him during conversations that had nothing to do with him. None of those things were inappropriate on their own. That was what made the situation so difficult to explain. Every individual moment seemed harmless. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. One Saturday afternoon, I returned home after helping a coworker move into a new house. The air carried the crisp chill of late autumn, and yellow leaves covered parts of the neighborhood. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a familiar vehicle parked outside. Tyler's vehicle. When I walked through the front door, I found Natalie and Tyler sitting at the kitchen island drinking coffee and laughing about a story from years ago. Neither of them appeared surprised to see me. Natalie smiled and asked how my day had gone. Tyler greeted me warmly. The interaction was polite and ordinary. Yet as I stood there listening to them continue their conversation, I felt like a guest inside my own home. What bothered me most was not that Tyler was there. It was that nobody seemed to consider whether I might feel uncomfortable about it. Later that evening, after Tyler left, Natalie commented on how nice it was that everyone could remain mature and get along. I remember standing by the sink looking out at the dark backyard while she loaded dishes into the dishwasher. The glow from the kitchen lights reflected against the window glass. I wanted to tell her that maturity was never the issue. Respect was. But I already knew how that conversation would end, so I stayed silent. A week later, we attended a neighborhood gathering. Music played softly from outdoor speakers while small groups of people stood around portable heaters talking beneath clear Colorado skies. Throughout the evening, I watched Natalie and Tyler move comfortably through conversations together. They shared memories, referenced old experiences, finished each other's thoughts in ways that made everyone smile. Standing there with a paper cup of hot cider in my hand, I experienced a realization that stayed with me long after the event ended. I was not competing against another man. I was competing against a version of the past that Natalie refused to leave behind. And the more I thought about it, the more exhausted I became. Looking back, I thought Tyler was the problem. I was wrong. The real problem was that my wife seemed willing to protect that connection at any cost, including the quiet damage it was causing to the marriage standing right in front of her. November gradually gave way to December, and with the arrival of the holiday season came a realization I had spent years avoiding. The problem was not that Tyler existed. The problem was the place he occupied in Natalie's mind. Once I understood that, I started noticing things I would have dismissed before. Not dramatic things. Not obvious things. Small details. The kind that reveal the truth only after they begin forming a pattern. One evening we were driving home from a holiday charity event in downtown Denver. Christmas lights lined the streets, and fresh snow had begun falling across the city. Natalie was talking about a challenge one of her coworkers was facing when she casually mentioned that Tyler would probably know exactly how to handle it. A few minutes later she laughed and said Tyler had always been good at reading people. Then she added that Tyler never let stressful situations get to him. None of those comments were directed at me. She never explicitly compared us. Yet by the time we reached home, I realized she had mentioned him 6 different times during a 20-minute drive. Looking back, I should have recognized that pattern years earlier. The comparisons were rarely direct. That was what made them so difficult to challenge. Tyler was always the example. Tyler was always the reference point. Tyler was always the person whose qualities seemed worth mentioning. A week later, we attended a holiday gathering hosted by one of our neighbors. The entire street looked like something from a movie. White lights wrapped around trees. Wreaths decorated front doors. Snow-covered rooftops beneath a clear Colorado sky. Inside the house, families gathered around tables filled with food while holiday music played softly in the background. At first, everything felt normal. Then I found myself standing near a group conversation where someone asked Natalie about the most adventurous period of her life. Without hesitation, she began telling stories about her college years. Tyler appeared in every one of them. The road trips, the spontaneous decisions, the unforgettable memories. Everyone listened with interest while she laughed and described experiences from 2 decades earlier. Standing there, I noticed something I had never fully admitted to myself. Whenever Natalie talked about those years, she sounded more alive than when she talked about our marriage. The thought stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Later that evening, I stepped outside onto the back patio to get some fresh air. Snowflakes drifted beneath the glow of string lights hanging overhead. The cold air felt sharp against my face. Through the large windows, I could see people laughing and talking inside. Natalie stood among them, smiling as she listened to Tyler tell another story. Looking back, I thought I was feeling jealousy. I was wrong. Jealousy implies that you are afraid of losing something. What I was feeling was something different. I was beginning to realize that part of my wife had never fully left the past behind. When we drove home that night, neither of us spoke much. The roads were quiet, and snow continued falling across the dark landscape. I kept replaying the evening in my head. Not because anything inappropriate had happened, because I finally understood why I always felt exhausted after events involving Tyler. I was trying to compete with a memory. Memories never age. They never disappoint anyone. They never have flaws. Over time, they become polished versions of reality, protected from criticism and strengthened by nostalgia. No real person can compete with that, especially a husband trying to build a future with someone who keeps looking backward. By the time we pulled into our driveway, a difficult truth had settled into my mind. I was not fighting another man. I was fighting an idealized chapter of Natalie's life. And for the first time, I began wondering whether that was a battle I should stop fighting altogether. January arrived with heavy clouds, colder mornings, and the kind of gray Colorado skies that make the entire landscape feel quieter. By then, I had stopped looking for evidence that something was wrong. I no longer needed evidence. The patterns were already clear. What I had not expected was the moment that would finally force me to stop making excuses for them. The event took place during a corporate holiday celebration that had been postponed until after the new year. One of Natalie's colleagues had rented a large ballroom at a downtown Denver hotel. The venue overlooked the city skyline through massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, warm lights reflected off polished marble floors while conversations echoed throughout the crowded room. It should have been an enjoyable evening. Looking back, it became the night I stopped pretending everything was fine. Tyler was there. By that point, his presence no longer surprised me. He moved easily through conversations, greeting people with the confidence of someone who belonged. Natalie seemed genuinely happy to see him. As the evening progressed, I found myself standing near a group gathered around one of the cocktail tables. Music played softly in the background while servers moved between clusters of guests carrying trays of appetizers. The atmosphere was relaxed and cheerful. Then someone brought up the topic of long-term friendships. Another person mentioned how unusual it was for former couples to remain close after so many years. Predictably, the conversation shifted toward Natalie and Tyler. Several people commented on how comfortable they seemed around each other. Most of it was harmless. Then one of the guests laughed and said something that caused the entire group to react. He joked that Natalie and Tyler looked more like a married couple than some actual married couples he knew. The comment was clearly intended as humor. Everyone laughed. Tyler laughed. The guest laughed. But what stayed with me was Natalie's reaction. She laughed too. Not the uncomfortable laugh of someone dismissing an inappropriate joke. Not the polite laugh people use to avoid awkwardness. She genuinely laughed along with everyone else. For a brief moment, I stood there smiling politely while something inside me quietly shifted. Nobody noticed. The conversation continued. New topics emerged. The evening moved forward. Yet I could not stop thinking about what had just happened. It was not the joke itself. It was the complete absence of awareness surrounding it. Nobody seemed to recognize how that comment might affect the person actually married to her. Later in the evening, I stepped away from the crowd and walked toward one of the large windows overlooking the city. Snow drifted through the darkness beyond the glass. The streets below glowed beneath rows of streetlights. From that distance, Denver looked peaceful. Natalie eventually joined me. She asked whether I was enjoying the event. I looked at her for a moment before answering. There were countless things I could have said. I could have explained why the joke bothered me. I could have described the growing distance I felt. I could have shared the concerns I had been carrying for years. Instead, I simply told her I was tired. She nodded and accepted the answer without asking anything further. Looking back, that moment revealed more than the joke itself. The problem was never that Natalie intentionally wanted to hurt me. The problem was that she had stopped seeing what I was experiencing altogether. During the drive home, neither of us spoke very much. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield while headlights stretched across the dark highway ahead. For the first time, I realized I was no longer angry. Anger requires energy. Anger requires hope that someone will understand. What I felt instead was disappointment. Deep, quiet disappointment. Because after years of conversations, explanations, and compromises, I finally understood something I had been avoiding. The hardest part of a struggling marriage is not feeling unseen. The hardest part is realizing the person beside you no longer notices that you are disappearing. February arrived quietly. The holiday decorations disappeared from front porches, the crowds thinned, and winter settled into its longest stretch. By then, something inside me had changed in a way that was difficult to explain. I was no longer looking for signs that Natalie understood my feelings. I was no longer waiting for a conversation that would suddenly fix everything. For years, I had believed that if I explained myself clearly enough, eventually she would see what I saw. Now I was beginning to understand that understanding cannot be forced. One Saturday morning, I woke before sunrise and drove west toward the foothills. The roads were nearly empty. Fresh snow covered the landscape, and the Rocky Mountains rose against the pale morning sky. I parked near a hiking trail I had not visited in years and spent several hours walking through the quiet wilderness. The only sounds were wind moving through pine trees and snow crunching beneath my boots. Somewhere during that hike, I realized how peaceful I felt. Not because my problems had disappeared, because for the first time in a very long time, I was not carrying them. Looking back, I thought anger would be the emotion that finally ended my marriage. I was wrong. The emotion was indifference. Not cruel indifference. Not bitterness. Just the gradual realization that I could no longer invest energy into a situation that never seemed to change. Over the following weeks, I started focusing more on myself. I accepted invitations from friends I had neglected. I returned to hobbies I had abandoned years earlier. I spent more time exercising. I stayed later at work when interesting projects appeared. None of these decisions were made to send a message. They were not acts of revenge. They were simply the choices of a man rediscovering parts of himself that had slowly disappeared. Natalie noticed. At first, her observations came in the form of casual questions. She asked why I had been spending so much time outside. She asked why I seemed busier than usual. She asked whether everything was all right. Each time, I told her the truth. Everything was fine. And strangely enough, it was. One evening, she mentioned that Tyler would be joining a group dinner later that week. In the past, a statement like that would have immediately triggered frustration. I would have replayed the conversation for hours. This time I simply nodded and continued reading the article open on my tablet. She paused for a moment and looked at me. I could almost see the confusion in her expression. My reaction no longer matched the role she expected me to play. A few days later, she asked if I wanted to join them. I told her I already had plans with an old friend. The disappointment on her face lasted only a second, but I noticed it. What she did not understand was that I was not choosing someone else over her. I was finally choosing myself. As February continued, a strange reversal began taking place. For years, I had been the one initiating difficult conversations. I had been the one asking questions. I had been the one trying to close the growing distance between us. Now Natalie seemed increasingly aware of that distance herself. One night after dinner, she asked whether something had changed. We were standing in the kitchen while snow drifted past the windows outside. The dishwasher hummed quietly in the background. I looked at her for a moment before answering. Then I told her I had simply been thinking about life lately. It was an honest answer, even if it was not the complete answer. Looking back, I think that was the moment she began sensing what I already knew. The most dangerous stage of a struggling relationship is not when people argue. Arguments still contain emotion. Arguments still contain effort. The truly dangerous stage arrives when one person becomes calm. Because calm often means they have stopped expecting anything to improve. And by the end of February, I was calmer than I had been in years. March arrived with longer days and the first signs of spring appearing across Colorado. Snow still lingered in shaded corners of parking lots, but the air felt different. The season was changing, and so was I. Looking back, this was the month when I finally understood something that hurt far more than anything Tyler had ever done. For years, I convinced myself that if he somehow disappeared from our lives, everything would improve. I thought the tension would fade. I thought the distance between Natalie and me would shrink. I thought our marriage would finally feel like a marriage again. I was wrong. One evening, I came home earlier than expected after a client meeting was canceled. The house was quiet. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows and stretched across the hardwood floors. Natalie was sitting alone on the couch, scrolling through photographs on her tablet. She did not notice me immediately. From where I stood, I could see images from years before we met. College events, road trips, gatherings with old friends. Tyler appeared in many of them. There was nothing inappropriate about the photographs themselves. They were simply memories. Yet something about the way Natalie looked at them stayed with me. She was smiling softly, completely absorbed in a version of life that existed decades earlier. When she finally noticed me, she quickly switched screens and asked how my day had gone. I answered normally and headed upstairs, but the image remained in my mind. That night, I found myself lying awake thinking about our entire marriage. The places we had lived, the vacations we had taken, the goals we had achieved together. Then a difficult question appeared. How often had Natalie been physically present while emotionally looking backward? A few days later, another moment reinforced that feeling. We attended a small gathering hosted by friends. The conversation drifted toward life-changing influences and the people who helped shape us into who we become. One by one, everyone shared their stories. When it was Natalie's turn, she mentioned family members, mentors, close friends, and eventually Tyler. Again, there was nothing unusual about that. What caught my attention was the way she described him. She spoke about him as if he remained an active part of the foundation beneath her life. Not someone from a completed chapter. Not someone she appreciated and moved beyond. Someone still occupying emotional space in the present. Driving home that evening beneath clear skies and distant mountain silhouettes, I finally stopped focusing on Tyler altogether. The truth arrived with surprising clarity. Tyler was not the center of the problem. The real issue was that Natalie had never fully released the version of herself connected to that period of her life. He represented memories, youth, possibilities, and a chapter she continued protecting long after it should have become part of the past. Looking back, that realization changed everything. It removed the competition entirely. I was never competing against another man. I was competing against nostalgia, against carefully preserved memories that became more perfect every year. Against a past that could never disappoint her because it no longer had the opportunity to be real. No husband can win against that. Nobody can. One Saturday morning, I sat alone on the back patio drinking coffee while the sun rose above the neighborhood. Birds moved between budding trees. The snow was finally beginning to disappear from nearby yards. For the first time in months, I felt calm. Not because I had solved anything. Because I finally understood what I was facing. The marriage could not improve unless Natalie recognized the emotional distance herself. It could not improve unless she chose the present over the comfort of the past. And deep down, I was no longer sure she even saw the difference. That realization should have devastated me. Instead, it brought peace. Because once you stop fighting the wrong battle, you stop exhausting yourself. And from that moment forward, my attention shifted completely. I was no longer trying to save the life I had. I was quietly preparing for the life that might come after it. April arrived with clear skies, warmer afternoons, and the kind of Colorado sunshine that makes people forget how long winter felt. The trees throughout our neighborhood were beginning to turn green again, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something that had nothing to do with my marriage. I felt hopeful. Not hopeful about Natalie and me. Hopeful about myself. Looking back, that distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. For years, nearly every major decision I made revolved around preserving our relationship. I adjusted plans, delayed opportunities, and ignored personal goals because I believed that was what commitment required. Somewhere along the way, I stopped building a life and started maintaining one. Now that was changing. One Saturday morning, an old college friend invited me to spend the day helping renovate a cabin near Boulder. A year earlier, I probably would have declined. This time I accepted immediately. The drive west took me through rolling hills and mountain roads lined with pine trees. The air smelled fresh, and patches of snow still lingered in shaded areas along the trailheads. We spent the entire day replacing sections of a weathered deck, drinking coffee, sharing stories, and laughing about mistakes we made when we were younger. As the sun began setting behind the mountains, I realized something surprising. I had not thought about Tyler once. I had not replayed conversations. I had not analyzed Natalie's behavior. For several hours, I had simply lived my life. That realization stayed with me during the drive home. Over the following weeks, I continued creating routines that belonged entirely to me. I started hiking regularly again. I attended professional networking events that I had ignored for years. I reconnected with friends I had slowly drifted away from during the marriage. None of these changes happened dramatically. They accumulated one decision at a time. One evening after work, I stayed late to discuss a leadership opportunity with a senior manager. The position would involve greater responsibility and a significant increase in income. In the past, I would have immediately focused on how such a change might affect our household routine. This time I found myself asking a different question. What do I actually want? It was a simple question, yet I had not asked it in years. Natalie noticed the changes. At first, she seemed merely curious. Then curiosity gradually became concern. She started asking where I had been spending my weekends. She wanted to know why I seemed busier. She asked about the people I was reconnecting with. Her questions were not hostile. If anything, they sounded uncertain. Looking back, I think she was seeing something she had never expected to see. For years, I had been the one trying to close the emotional distance between us. Now I was learning how to live beyond it. One evening, she suggested we take a weekend trip together. The proposal caught me off guard because it had been a long time since she initiated anything like that. I thanked her and told her I already had plans to spend the weekend hiking with friends near Estes Park. For a brief moment, disappointment crossed her face. Then she smiled and said she understood. The conversation ended, but the expression remained in my mind. Another week later, she invited me to dinner at a new restaurant downtown. Once again, I already had commitments. Once again, she seemed surprised. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years, I had been asking for more connection. Now that I had stopped asking, she finally seemed interested in creating it. One evening near the end of April, I sat alone on the back patio watching the sun disappear behind the Rocky Mountains. The sky glowed orange and gold while a cool breeze moved through the neighborhood. Children rode bicycles down the street. Birds settled into nearby trees. Everything felt peaceful. As I looked across the horizon, I thought about the man I had been 6 months earlier. He spent every day trying to save a marriage. The man sitting there now was doing something entirely different. He was building a future. And for the first time, I understood that those two goals were no longer the same. May arrived with bright mornings, clear mountain views, and the unmistakable feeling that another season was ending. By then, the emotional distance between Natalie and me was no longer something hidden beneath everyday routines. It existed openly, even if neither of us spoke about it directly. The difference was that I had already accepted it. Natalie was only beginning to see it. Looking back, that month felt like watching two people arrive at the same destination from opposite directions. One evening after work, I came home to find dinner already prepared. The dining room table was set, candles were lit, and soft music played through the speakers in the living room. For a moment, I thought I had forgotten an anniversary or some important date. Natalie smiled and told me she simply wanted us to spend time together. Years earlier, that gesture would have meant everything to me. It was exactly the kind of effort I had hoped for during countless difficult conversations. Yet sitting across from her that evening, I felt strangely calm. We talked about work, family, and upcoming summer plans. The conversation was pleasant, comfortable even, but beneath the surface, I could sense something else. Natalie was trying to reconnect. She was reaching for a version of our relationship that had already begun slipping away. A few days later, she suggested a weekend getaway to the mountains. The proposal surprised me because spontaneous trips had never really been her idea before. I thanked her and told her I already had plans. She looked disappointed. This time she did not hide it. As silence settled between us, I realized something important. For years, I had been the one adjusting my schedule, changing priorities, and making room whenever she needed it. Now the situation was reversed, and neither of us seemed to know what to do with that change. Throughout May, similar moments continued happening. Natalie asked more questions. She paid closer attention. She initiated conversations that once felt impossible. In another version of our story, those efforts might have changed everything. The problem was timing. Effort matters most when it arrives before someone stops believing it will ever come. One Saturday afternoon, I returned from a hiking trip near Estes Park. The mountains were beautiful that day. Patches of snow still rested on distant peaks, while green valleys stretched beneath a bright blue sky. The drive home gave me several hours alone with my thoughts. By the time I reached our neighborhood, I already knew what I needed to do. I just had not said it out loud yet. When I walked inside, I found Natalie sitting in the living room reading. She looked up immediately. There was a nervousness in her expression that had become increasingly common over the past few weeks. She asked if we could talk. Something in her voice told me she had been preparing for this conversation. We sat across from each other as late afternoon sunlight filled the room. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Natalie asked whether I was unhappy. The question lingered in the air between us. Looking back, I realized it was not really the question she wanted answered. What she truly wanted to know was whether I had already left emotionally. I took a slow breath before responding. Then I told her the truth. I explained that I had spent years feeling invisible. I explained that every concern I raised eventually became a debate about my reaction rather than the issue itself. I explained that over time I stopped expecting anything to change. Natalie listened quietly. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. For the first time in years, she simply listened. When I finished speaking, tears filled her eyes. She admitted that she had noticed the distance growing, but never believed it would reach this point. That answer hurt more than I expected because it revealed the deepest problem of all. She saw the distance. She just assumed I would remain there forever waiting for her to address it. As evening shadows stretched across the room, I realized the decision had already been made long before this conversation began. The only thing left was accepting it. And while Natalie was finally beginning to understand what was happening, I had quietly reached that understanding months earlier. 3 months later, summer had settled comfortably across Colorado. The snow was long gone from the foothills, the days stretched late into the evening, and the mountains stood beneath clear blue skies that seemed to go on forever. By then, my life looked completely different from the one I had spent years trying to preserve. The conversations Natalie and I began in May eventually led to the decision neither of us could avoid. There was no dramatic confrontation, no explosive ending, just two people finally acknowledging a truth that had been growing quietly between them for a very long time. The legal process moved forward respectfully. We divided what needed to be divided, signed what needed to be signed, and stepped into separate futures. I moved into a smaller home on the western edge of Denver. Large windows overlooked the foothills, and every evening the setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and orange. The house was quiet, peaceful. Looking back, peace was what I had been searching for all along. Then one Saturday morning in August, the moment I mentioned months earlier finally arrived. I had just finished making coffee when someone knocked on my front door. The sound echoed through the house. I set down my mug and walked across the living room. When I opened the door, Natalie was standing there. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. A gentle breeze moved through the trees lining the street, while morning sunlight illuminated the front porch. She looked nervous, more nervous than I had ever seen her. Not because she was angry, because she was uncertain. I invited her inside. We sat across from each other in the living room while sunlight streamed through the windows. The mountains were visible in the distance beyond the glass. For several moments, neither of us knew how to begin. Eventually, Natalie spoke first. She admitted that she had spent the previous months reflecting on everything that happened. She said she finally understood many of the concerns I had tried to express over the years. She admitted that she often dismissed feelings she should have taken seriously. She admitted that she assumed I would always remain there no matter how much distance developed between us. Then she said something I never expected to hear. She told me she wished she had listened sooner. The room became very quiet after that. I listened carefully without interrupting, without correcting her, without trying to win anything. Because by then, I no longer needed validation. I no longer needed proof that my feelings had been real. Natalie explained that she had gradually realized how much emotional space she continued giving to a chapter of life that should have remained in the past. She said that Tyler had become less important than the memories attached to him. She admitted that protecting those memories had slowly distracted her from protecting the marriage standing directly in front of her. Hearing those words was strangely comforting, not because they changed the outcome, because they confirmed something I had questioned for years. I was not imagining the distance. It had been real. The loneliness had been real. The disappointment had been real. Natalie eventually asked whether there was any chance we could start over. Looking back, that question would have meant everything to me a year earlier. Yet sitting there that morning, I felt only gratitude and clarity. I thanked her for her honesty. I told her I genuinely hoped she found happiness. I told her I had forgiven her long ago. But I also explained that forgiveness does not always rebuild what has been lost. Sometimes forgiveness simply allows people to move forward without carrying resentment. Tears filled her eyes. Mine remained dry, not because I cared less, because I had already completed that emotional journey months earlier. We spoke for another half hour before standing to say goodbye. When she reached the front door, we exchanged one final smile. Not the smile of two people beginning again. The smile of two people finally understanding what happened. After she left, I stood on the porch watching her car disappear down the street. The mountains stretched across the horizon beneath a perfect summer sky. For a long time, I simply stood there enjoying the silence. Then I went back inside and continued with my day. That was the moment I truly understood something important. Self-respect is not about proving your worth to someone else. It is about recognizing your worth even when someone else cannot. Looking back on this journey, I often wonder what others would have done in my position. If you were watching this story unfold, at what moment would you have realized the marriage was changing? Do you think it could have been saved if the warning signs had been addressed sooner? Share your thoughts because every perspective tells a different story. And if stories about resilience, relationships, personal growth, and finding strength through difficult choices resonate with you, consider subscribing so you do not miss future journeys like this one. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from ordinary people learning when it is finally time to choose themselves.